Hello guys, today we learn routing in MVC. ASP.NET introduced routing to eliminate needs of mapping each URL with physical file. Basically, routing enables us to define URL pattern that map to request handler. This request handler can be a file or class. In ASP.NET Webform, request handler is .aspx file, and in MVC it is controller class and action method. Let us see one example. Domain name students can be mapped to domain name studentinfo.spx in ASP.NET Webform. While in MVC, the same URL can be mapped to student control and index action method in MVC, like localhost controller name, home, and action method index. Now let us consider route. What is route? Basically, route defines the URL pattern and handler informations. All the configure routes of an application is stored in route table and will be used by routing engine to determine appropriate handler class or file in incoming request. See the diagram. If we give a URL request, that this is the routing engine. If you give the URL request, URL matches with configure route, and from route tables matching will be taken place. If match will not match, then we found 404 errors. In the case of matching find, execute controllers an action method perform and give the response to the users. That's why MVC works. Now, how to configure a route? Every MVC application must configure at least one route, which is configured by MVC framework by default. You can register a route in RouteConfig class, which is RouteConfig.cs under app start folder. Let us see. Go to file, new project, consider web, ASP.NET web applications, click on OK button, choose empty project and select MVC and click on OK button. See here app start, there is route config file. Here we can see route.map route, name default, URL means controller name, action which can be executed, and ID. And defaults here we define new controller home, action index, and parameter ID which is optional. Let us see. The route is configured using map route extension method of route collection where name is default, URL pattern is controller action and ID, and default parameter for controller action method and ID parameter. Default specify which controller action method or value ID of parameter should be used if they do not exist in the incoming request URL. What is URL pattern? The URL pattern is considered only after domain name part in the URL. For example, the URL pattern like controller action ID would look like localhost 1234 controller name action ID. Anything after localhost would be considered as a controller name. If the URL didn't contain anything after the domain name, then the default controller and action method will handle a request. For example, if localhost 1234 would be handled by home controller and index method is configured, right? Default parameters. Also, we can define multiple routes in the route config. Let us see. You can also configure a custom route using map route extension method. You need to provide at least two parameters in map route name and URL pattern. The default parameter is optional. You can register multiple custom routes with different names. Let us see here we have registered a student route. Here route dot map route name student URL student ID, which means every controller will access by controller and their ID. Here define controller student action index. This is the default route. Like we can copy here and we can paste on route constraints. Also, if we can define the constraints of parameters, like you define one to only fs, the integer value of parameter, then we can add a constant like go here, like see here, name student URL student ID name student ID, default new controller student URL action ID URL parameter name equal to URI parameter optional and standard ID optionals. And here we have constant new ID and here we have added regular space and D means only digit can be allowed. If URL pattern will match, it will give the results. Otherwise, another route.map route name student and URL pattern student and ID. Here we define action index, controller name students and ID optional parameter. Now run the application. Here we see default we getting index page and type here students get nothing and type parameter optional parameter 123 get the result 123. By doing this you see here student controller method had defined the student controller and method index and passing optional parameter integer 32 and id and return to a string. So this way routings will be held in MVC and you can register the routing in application start in event global.exe file. Open global.exe file and here we define RouteConfig.register routes route table.routes. Thank you guys. Have a nice day. Please subscribe my YouTube channels.